Hi, this is Dr. Brian Williams. I'm Dean of the Templeton Honors College and host of the podcast Forged, and I am coming to you today from St. David's, Pennsylvania.
And I'm Christine Perrin in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, hosting the podcast Composed. And we are exploring what are the patterns that compose our lives that help us to flourish.
Great. Christine, I'm so delighted to be on here with you and to be co-hosting these two podcasts together for the Humanitas Institute. I wonder if I could get you talking about the name of your podcast, Composed. When you
Absolutely.
think about just when you think of the word composed, what does that mean to you, and why is that the name of your podcast?
Well, I actually heard someone else a long time ago talking about the art of composing a life. So I think of it in that form, composing, not
Mm.
necessarily composed.
You are very
Something
composed, though, I will say that.
Well, I'm glad I've fooled you. But this notion that we are homo viator, we're on the way,
Mm, mm.
and we are composing something that is whole, that fits together and has integrity, and we want to learn from people who have done that.
Mm.
I find often it's interesting that we put one thing in place in our lives and all these other things follow.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in the human goods that people have embraced in particular ways that
Mhm.
have created flourishing in the life of their family and themselves, their teaching.
Yeah, that's beautiful. As a child, my dad was a music professor, and he had a friend, John Coates, come out from Nashville every year, and John would stay with us, and we had a Steinway grand piano in the front room. And
Mm.
I remember getting up on several mornings watching John compose at the piano. And it was the first time as a child I realized how music was made, that you could make music from these notes. But one of the interesting things that I remember him doing is I remember him putting a single line of notes across the graph first, and that was the melody line. And then everything else, had to complement that melody line. And so it just reminds me of what you've just described there, having those kind of rhythms and
Mm.
rituals and patterns that are the core of your life, and then they give shape to everything else. And I think I saw that with John Coates composing at the piano. But it sounds similar. Is that similar? Is that similar to what you're describing?
Absolutely. That's a very beautiful analogy. I'm curious about how old you were when that happened.
Oh, I was young. I mean, I remember I was probably 6 or 7,
Hmm.
and John would come out every spring and arrange music for my dad's musical group and compose it, and I remember coming out, and John was already at the piano, and I remember sitting there on these steps just watching him do that. So I was probably 1st or 2nd grade, I would imagine, and watching a composer, make silent music in my front room. But he would dink on the piano and then write notes. But it was that melody line that really I think was the core for everything else. And then by the time I'd come back in the afternoon or evening after school, the whole page would be filled up with all kinds of other notes. But it started with that melody line.
That is fascinating. I'm thinking about parallel experiences in my own life.
Mhm.
One question I love to ask people about is an early memory of beauty, but that's a bit of a different question.
Mm.
The kinds of things, for instance, when Chris became the head of a classical school, which meant that our
Mm.
kids were going to be going to school there. Our oldest daughter was in first grade, and all these things fell into line around that,
Oh, right.
decision, and that pattern in our lives, which involved, um, a community, a daily, rhythm, and also just a lot of commitments on our part for how we were gonna spend our time, who we were gonna spend our time
Mhm.
with. That's another big example in my own experience.
Yeah, so how did you write the melody line, if you will? Sorry, I'm going with the
Mm,
music metaphor here. I know you're a
I like
poet,
it.
so you compose, poems. But I'm not a musician, but I think like one probably. So, how did you end up deciding, what the melody line was going to be for your family? Like, how did you decide what notes you were going to lay down, or what you were going to be committed to? I guess. as you
Well,
composed your own life, yeah, as you were composing, your life with your family?
yeah, it's interesting because Christopher Alexander, who's been a big inspiration for these kinds of questions,
Mm,
said that we all have these um, needs that have to be resolved or conflicts that have to be resolved, and it often just emerges organically from our own lives, the kinds of questions that we have, our needs that we have to solve, and this was no different from that. We
mm.
had a daughter who was in kindergarten who had, that precocious oldest child started observing the first grade teacher and started telling me things about the first grade teacher. So then I went and observed, and
Yeah.
so we realized we needed a school, and we
Oh.
had read this. You know, we had read an article about classical education. It sounded great to us.
Mm, mm,
Education mattered greatly to both of us. We wanted to do
mhm.
it differently than the way that we had been raised,
Right.
and so we applied, and that happened before Chris was actually hired to be the headmaster.
You applied to
Um,
put your daughter in the school,
we
you mean?
did,
Yes,
yeah.
okay, okay. That was the first step.
And, we knew a few things about it. We knew what was valuable, but that was many years ago. Our daughter's 34. So things have changed,
Yeah,
and there
yeah.
was, people were trying to explain it, trying to say, well, it really matters, the kinds of subjects that you study, the way that people live together, the kind of things that you do in the home. They were
Mm, mm,
trying to
yep.
grasp at things, but we caught that tune, I think,
Yeah.
and could envision ourselves pursuing that with our children.
So were you in a community then where you saw people, you might say, kind of living the classical tradition, not just teaching it? I mean, was it a way of life for people in the school and this community, or
Mm.
did that develop with you guys there? Or did you come into a community that had its own rhythms?
The school was starting with us.
Oh, with you.
So at the
Okay.
very
Okay.
time we applied,
Okay.
it was really a gift to us.
Yeah.
And I would say that we all kind of stumbled towards it.
Mm,
We
mm,
groped towards it.
yeah.
We didn't know what that first line of music was, except that we very much wanted it to be different than what we had had and different than what we were seeing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I teach a class called The Ordinary Life to graduating university seniors. And we think about the various parts of an ordinary embodied human life. We think about work and money and sex and family and art and play. And we often start class where I go around and say, what did you inherit from your mom and dad about this topic? What kind of
Mm,
patterns were laid down in your family, and what are you bringing with you into the ordinary life you're about ready to start living? And it's that first moment for many of them where they realize, oh, yeah, I need to become aware of the patterns that I grew up with, because maybe I don't want to perpetuate those patterns. Maybe I do. Maybe they were really life-giving, healthful patterns, but it's a moment week by week for my students to stop and think and say, "Oh, this is how mom handled money. This was dad's relationship to
mm.
money. Now let's read something about money and then make a decision about how I want to relate to money going forward, or romance or sex or whatever it happens to be." But it
What a
seems like,
useful evaluation at that point in their lives.
oh, right,
That's
because they're
phenomenal.
22 and they're getting ready to leave university and start to set down some of those habits and patterns that will either sustain them or drain them in the years and decades
Mhm.
to come. And so I tell them, "Hey, I'm 54. It's a lot harder for me to change my habits and patterns than it is for you, because I have an extra 32 years practicing them. But you're at a moment where you're going to leave university, you're going to start a family, you're going to start a career, and you have the opportunity to lay down some new rhythms and patterns and habits with respect to all of these topics that we're discussing, related to an ordinary life." But it sounds like you came to that realization even before you came to school, to just say, what we grew up with or what we inherited is not the pattern we want to set for our family.
Yes, and interesting, the language that Alexander uses is living patterns and dead patterns.
Okay.
I would say almost all the patterns that I had that were good came from my family's home practices. So it wasn't a rejection of what they
Right.
gave me. We did lots of reading, we did lots of discussing,
Okay.
hiking, bird watching, learning the names of things,
Yeah.
reciting. My dad always recited literature to me.
Oh,
Um,
beautiful.
kept a quote notebook,
Mm.
and pulled it out when it was relevant. So those things, and my
Yeah.
mom was a maker, she
Okay.
did gardens and she
Yep.
did art and she did food. And so those were things that somehow intuitively I wanted to be more central in
Right.
my children's lives. But in terms of what I had experienced formally,
Oh, at school.
I
Right.
wanted something different.
Got it.
At college, I had the education of an apprentice education because I had master um, writers who
Okay.
were teaching me, and that was instructive. How
Okay.
about you? Tell us a little bit about the forged name, and maybe you've given us this beautiful metaphor of learning the melody line as part of a
Yeah.
composition, but maybe you could tell us about a melody line in your own life. I know you well enough to suggest a few, but I'll let you take your course.
Sure, sure, sure. We'll see. And once I stumble through an answer, you can help me recover, I think. Yeah, I mean, the podcast name for my podcast is Forged, and it's similar to composed, but I don't know, maybe a little. I don't know if it's more violent, if it's hotter, if there's a greater struggle there. But to
Mhm,
forge, I think of like a sword forged,
mhm,
heated up, made pliable, made soft, hammered into shape. The forge. Or I remember growing up, there was a place near where I grew up in the Ozarks of Southern Missouri called Silver Dollar City, and it was kind of an amusement park, but really a kind of arts and crafts kind of community. And I remember watching glass being blown in a
mm,
forge,
hmm.
and glass, which is hard, being heated up, being made soft and pliable, and then created because it was heated and subjected to that kind of pressure, was made into something beautiful. And so I think with the idea of forge, the idea for me is what are those, not just what are those negative pressures, but what are the ways that we are forging
Hmm.
our life, and what are the hard challenges that we might face that shape our life, but also how are we intentionally subjecting our lives to a certain kind of form? Because when you are forging something, the artist obviously has something in mind, right? He has some image that he wants this horseshoe or this sword or this plow or this piece of glass. He has a form. He wants to take this material and shape it into that form. And so I think for me, that's what we're thinking about. What is the form of that life that I want to be formed into, or that I want to be impressed upon my life or imprinted upon my life? And that could be very many, lots of things. Like, I have a real penchant for hand thrown pottery. And I
Mm.
love hand thrown mugs, and I love hand thrown wine goblets. And every single one of them I mean, I call it a collection, but it's like William Morris's everything, is useful and beautiful in our coffee mugs and our wine goblets. They're all different. They're all different shapes. They're all different patterns. They all have different glazes on them. They're slightly different. The one I'm holding right now has a really slender shape, and it's a lovely bluish green. And so when we think about forging our lives after some form, it doesn't mean they're all going to look identical, but it
Mhm.
means they all are going to yeah, take some sort of shape.
Yeah.
Otherwise, this would be a lump of clay.
Yes.
Right, and I think sometimes life feels like it's a lump of clay,
It
and I
does.
have
Those
and I have no
feelings.
shape, right? And so there's
Yes.
really seasons when you're left going, "Okay, I feel like a lump of clay. I don't have form, I don't have order, I don't have shape, and things don't seem to be going so well for me." So I think that's for me when I think of forged. I think, how do I take the stuff of my life? How do I take my loves, my passions, my interests, my opportunities, and shape them into something meaningful that, to use William Morris's phrase again, is both useful and beautiful.
That's wonderful, Brian. You make me wanna read to you Miłosz's short poem called Blacksmith Shop. I bet
Ooh.
you know it.
I do know it, but I would always happy for you to read a poem, Christine.
All right, I'll be quick. I liked the bellows operated by rope, a hand or a foot pedal, I don't remember, but that blowing and blazing of fire and a piece of iron in the fire, held there by tongs, red, softened, ready for the
Mm.
anvil. Eaten with a hammer, bent into a horseshoe, thrown in a bucket of water, sizzle, steam, and horses hitched to be shod, tossing their manes. And in the grass by the river, plowshares, sledge
Oh,
runners, harrows waiting for repair. At the entrance, my bare feet on the dirt floor, here gusts of heat at my back, white clouds. I stare and stare. It seems I was called for this, to glorify things just because they are.
oh, that's why everybody should do a podcast with a poet right there, and I think I found my my theme poem. Christine, that was so beautiful.
Well,
That
you
was
were
so
saying those
beautiful.
things. You
Yeah,
were
just
saying
not
all
quite
those
as
things
eloquently.
about your life, and
Mm,
I find your image really beautiful. The fact
mm,
that fire, um, and even like the firing of
yeah.
ceramic of clay turns it into something usable. And I think of those students that you're talking about that you deal with every
Mm,
year.
mm, mhm.
I know you teach the good life and you teach the ordinary life, and um, you're giving them some forms for their clay, some
Yeah,
heat.
yeah, that's right. Because I sometimes think I can't walk you through the hard times when they come.
Mm.
But there is a way in which you can prepare yourself to be the kind of person who can endure the hard things when they come, right? So sometimes
Yes.
I ask them, what kind of person do you need to start being now so that when the hard things come, you're able to bear them well? And you're able to enjoy them well. I mean, a lot of what we talk about in my class, The Ordinary Life, is simply how do we enjoy these things well? How do we
Mm.
live well with our work and vocation and money and home and friends and church and these kinds of things. And so that's what we're doing a little bit in that. It's a little bit like taking people on a tour, and this is like telling them about where they're going to go, right? So that when
Mhm.
they get there, they have some sense of where they are, right? Like when
Mhm.
you go to Orvieto, Italy. It's like the first time it's like, well, this is what it's going to be like. It's going to, but you don't know it till you get there, but you have some sense once you land, "Oh, okay, this was described to me. This isn't my first time to think about what I'm experiencing right now."
Makes me think of Jill Poole when Aslan told her the signs, that she had
Oh,
to
that's right.
remember, and she almost
That's
forgot
good.
them. She
Yeah.
did forget them, and then she got there and fled, and, dredged them up. What a gift to those
Yeah.
students. Do you have a pattern in your own life that you'd like to share that has been one of those forging
Yeah.
elements?
Yeah, well, that have forged in a way, have forged a life or composed a life. I mean, there are a number of things that come immediately to mind that my wife Kim and I have kind of built into the pattern and rhythms of our lives, or that I've done. I mean, I suppose one. A couple come to mind. As you know, I'm a runner. I like to spend some time on the trails and on the road running, and I used to do a lot of biking, and I think that has built a pattern into my life of using my body, of being an ordinary embodied human being, and the goodness of celebrating just the fact that I have a useful body, that it can do things, and so when I'm out running in the woods now, I have a dog. My dog Luna, Christina, and I both have Vishlas. And if you know Vishlas at all, we'll take your sympathy. Thank you, because there's a lot of dog packed in a little Vishla. I run with mine, and it's for 20 years I've probably been a runner, and for 10 years before that I did a lot of biking, and it's just kind of a regular rhythm. It seems to, I mean, in this way it disciplines me in all kinds of ways. I watch what I eat because I know, gosh, if I eat all that, it's going to make tomorrow's run harder. I watch my sleep because I'm like, I want tomorrow's run to be really invigorating and refreshing, and I need my sleep. And so it kind of forms a pattern for my life, just having this regular occurrence of using my body in that kind of way, and just really living into being, yeah, an embodied soul, as I might describe myself. Another pattern is I have a real love, as you know, of art and beauty, and so we have. I'm just looking at some examples from my art collection on the walls right now. But Kim, my wife Kim, is an artist and an art teacher, And so one of the first things we did when we were getting together, we went up to the great Nelson Atkins Art Museum in Kansas City, near where we were living at the time, and having art in our homes, having um, Kim creating art, enjoying art. For us, often the theater or visual art museums, paintings, those kinds of things. That's been a regular life-giving pattern for us. Participating in beauty. Moral philosophers call this one of the basic human goods, like the kinds of things that are just good for us given the nature we have as humans. Like there are things that are good for our dogs because they have the nature they have, right? There are things that are good for a plant, just given the nature a plant has. I'm looking at trees out my window, and things that are good for us as humans. And one of them is health in our bodies, and another one is participating in beauty and building those into what Albert Borgman, the philosopher of technology, called focal practices. The kind of practices that you build into your lives so that those wonderful moments you might have aren't just haphazard and episodic.
Mm.
Christine, you guys are so good at hosting great dinner parties. And some of my favorite dinner parties and conversations have been around your dining room table. Um, and we all have those experiences where we have a great dinner party with friends, and then you're like, "Oh, that was fun." And it never happens again
Mm.
unless you make it a focal practice for your life, or a brisk walk in the woods that's, you find really invigorating or beautiful. But it just becomes episodic or haphazard unless you make it a focal practice in your
Mhm.
life. And same with like beauty and the arts. For us, it's a focal practice. That one of the things we do whenever we get the flyers in the mail about all the theaters in the Philly area, their plays that they're producing the next year, we'll kind of say, "Oh, we want to go see Much Ado About Nothing there, and we want to go see Raisin in the Sun there," just so we make sure that we are building focal practices around these basic human goods into our life. So those are a couple for me: art and running or being outdoors, mountaineering and stuff. But what about you? And what are kind of either focal practices or kind of the melody lines that
Mm.
you've set down?
Thank you for continuing to establish that metaphor. Um, I have some questions I want to ask about your focal practices, but
Okay.
I'll get started. You know, one you mentioned having people over for dinner,
Yeah.
and I think there's something about feasting
Mm.
with others and drawing out conversation that is, like you say, not episodic, not chaotic or
Yeah.
haphazard.
Yeah.
Um, how many times have we all sat in places with people that we really wanted to know what they thought,
Yeah.
but somehow just couldn't gather things up? So one of the things that
Mm.
Chris and I have started to do is to ask table-wide questions, when we're with people, and
Yeah.
we'll do it at our house, but, I'm sorry to say we'll also do it at other people's houses. It's a little intrusive, but what
Beware of having Christine Perrin over to your dinner party. You will start having conversations about interesting things. So if that's not what you want, don't have Christine over. But if that's what you want, you're a
it
wonderful dinner
just
guest.
is such a joy.
Yeah.
And we have a few questions that are always wonderful. For
Okay.
instance, tell us about an early experience of beauty, an early
Mm.
memory of beauty.
Mm.
And you just told us about yours with your father's friend
Yeah.
composing at the piano. That's an extraordinary experience. Um, I
Yeah, that's an
remember.
amazing question, Christine. I remember one of my favorite moments with you. We were sitting on a rooftop
uh,
somewhere in Phoenix, I believe, and there were a bunch of us
was
grabbed some like takeout dinner, and we're on the roof of a hotel. It was a beautiful night, and you probably introduced that question, and there were probably 12 of us, and then like 4 hours later, I think we were all like, "Oh, we should wrap up and call it a
That's
night."
the
But it
thing.
was just we were all caught up in that question, but it came about because you intentionally asked us to all think about it and share.
And so much emerges surrounding it. There's
Yeah.
the context of someone's life, there's
Mhm.
what you find out about. I mean, I think one of our friends told us that, he grew up extremely poor,
Yeah.
and, and his mother, introduced beauty into his life. And these things that you
Yeah.
just would never know that then also cause you to reflect on your own life, your own context, and the kinds of things that were focal practices, to use your language, of your own family. So
Yeah.
for me, one of them was my parents just insisted. We also didn't have a lot of money, and they just insisted that we were going to hike wherever we were.
Yeah, good
And I
for them.
remember being 6 and living in Japan and, everything being strange and going into the mountains, these I still think of them as misty and experiencing Japan through those green mountains, the forests that had, trees with prayers tied to them and,
Oh,
coming
wow.
upon shrines and, finishing the hike with a bottle of soda that was, shaped like a fish, in green glass
I
with
don't know because I I
a
didn't grow up
marble
in
in its
Japan, so
throat. For my
okay.
50th birthday, I went back and found one of those on eBay,
Yeah, that's great.
because I just thought, "Oh, this is such a
Yeah,
beautiful object," but it
yeah,
was an ordinary object of my childhood, but
right.
contained in it. And I
Mm,
think that's the
mm.
other thing is you begin to realize, well, these are like containers for
That's
my
right.
imagination.
Yeah, what were the containers? The objects or those kind of moments and practices?
Well, I think in my case, and maybe this is just I think it's a little of both, but I think the
Okay.
objects really carry the
Mm,
memories so well.
yeah.
And in the case of the ones I just described, that soda bottle, um, the the trees with the prayers tied to them, even just the feeling of getting out into the woods and getting going, and that fear of being bored,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
green all around,
yeah.
um, that sense of quiet that
Mm,
was all
mhm.
around you that was at first unwelcome.
Oh, yeah, it's unsettling if you're not
Yeah,
used to quiet. I mean, it's often I've read several, reports of folks who grew up in the city, city kids used to subway, buses, trains, and then going out into the woods and being, yeah, profoundly unsettled by it because they've
yes.
never actually heard quiet before or heard silence before.
Yeah, and Wendell Berry, even in his essay on Entrance into Woods, talks about the fact he
Mm,
does this as a focal practice every month or so. He'll go for 24 hours into the
yeah.
woods, and he talks about the almost profound despair that settles on you at first when you are
Oh,
leaving
interesting.
a place and you're trying to you realize how
Mhm.
maybe unimportant you are,
No,
and
what you
how
realize is that when you come back from those moments, that the world just went on living without you just
it did,
fine, you know?
did.
I used to one regular practice I've had over the years, I don't get to do it every year, but I've done it probably 12, 15 times over the years, is to take 4 or 5 days away by myself somewhere.
Yes.
Where, I used to, when I could, my mom and dad have a cabin down in the Ozarks, of Southern Missouri, and I've gone there several times by myself, and I've just been alone for 4 or 5 days, and you settle in, your spirit calms,
Yes.
and you settle into the silence so that when you come back out of that and you hear voices, on the one hand, when you hear voices, you're like, that it sounds harsh. I don't want to hear all this noise again. But yes, you also realize how small you are because you're like, yeah, everything went trucking along in the world just fine without me. But it's also encouraging because you're like, oh, you know what? I can take 3 or 4 days away by myself. I can take 2 days away by myself, and the world is not going to fall apart. And so I have that kind of freedom, if I can. I think about that, Christine, and one question I have for you is, what will your children say, or what do your children say were the focal practices or the melody line of their lives growing up in
Mm.
your household? I mean, one for us, we lived well, we did this before we moved. We lived in Kansas, and in Kansas City, there was a great Shakespeare festival every year called Free Will, and it was free Shakespeare in the
Oh,
park across
nice.
from the Nelson Atkins, and you would just bring your own picnic and a bottle of wine, and you'd set up, and you'd see some pretty fantastic Shakespeare plays, and there was always a puppet show version for kids before the real
Oh,
version.
that's great.
And so, like, you'd see a puppet show version of Othello, and Iago would be green because he's envious, and then our kids would come over and we'd watch the real one and they'd fall asleep halfway through. But then when we moved to Oxford, we were living close to Stratford upon Avon, so we'd go up to the Royal Shakespeare and we'd buy nosebleed seats. But even when our kids were 5 or 6 or 7, we'd take them to see live Shakespeare. And I would provide a little kind of running commentary in their ear, and they didn't catch all the language, but they knew who the bad guys were and they knew who the good guys were, right? And so one time we're driving through Oxford after we had recently seen Hamlet, and my 6-year-old son said, "Hey, Dad, who's that guy with the sword?" And I was like, "Well, there were a lot of them, son. Who do you mean?" And he said, "Oh, the guy in that that play." And I said, "Oh, Hamlet." And he goes, "Oh yeah, I like that guy. I want to see him again." Right? And he's 6 years
Oh,
old, and so you're like,
that's
he missed
fantastic.
98% of what was said, but yet he had the experience and he knew, who the central character was. And so we've just done that over the course of our lives. And I'm doing that with my 9-year-old daughter now. We
Mm.
recently saw Twelfth Night and we recently saw Much Ado About Nothing. And so we buy cheap tickets to live
Yeah.
Shakespeare. And then, my kids are old enough, they've have enough friends now, and they realize that not a lot of their other friends don't have that experience. And it wasn't that we were spending lots of money to do this. We were just trying to give them the experience of seeing live theater and seeing good stories told well. So that's
Mm.
one of the rhythms of that I think my kids will look back on and say, "Oh yeah, mom and dad took us to see some pretty great Shakespeare plays."
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, it's so nice to hear what other people do and to watch and inhabit other people's lives
Yeah,
and
yeah.
kind of make your list. Um, I hate to speak for my children. We did have, my parents had a little cabin without running water, um,
Mm,
up at Pine Grove Furnace, the Michaud State Forest,
okay.
and we started to go there once a week in the summers, the
Oh
kids and
wow.
I, during the day.
Oh,
We
lovely.
would hike,
Okay.
and then we would have our rest time. We always had a quiet time, where people would read or think uh, and we'd have rest time there, and sometimes we would stay overnight, but often it was just
Yeah.
being in the woods, playing in the woods. There were bows and arrows. Um, that was, again, as similar along the lines of what we're talking about, of just
Yeah.
getting away, being in nature, being
Yep.
immersed.
Yep.
People call it forest bathing, but, I I think that's a little,
That's a bit much,
fancy.
but I get the idea. That's really lovely. That was my mom. My grandma would walk a mile after dinner every night out on the farm in
Mhm.
in South Central Kansas, and she did that until she was well into her 80s, and so we grew up walking a mile with grandma into the back pasture, and then my mom carried that
Fantastic.
on, and so, that's when we weren't watching TV, there was nothing to distract us, and it was
Yeah.
just us and mom would name the flowers, and we'd look at trees, and we'd look at the sky, and I happen to grow up near some woods, and so, would walk the deer trails and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
that just sense of being, and nobody, you weren't you weren't mall walking, as we call it. You weren't walking for fitness, right? You were walking to be together in God's good creation, and
Yes.
that's a really lovely, simple practice, isn't it?
It is, and I like, especially in the suburbs, you can learn so much about flowers because
Yeah.
people have
Mm,
gardens and you can start to name
mm,
those flowers. Some It's interesting, some of your children are more interested in those things than
right.
others,
Yep.
um, but it sticks, just the rehearsal of it.
It does, it does. I mean, it is interesting to hear my children reflect on their, what they remember us doing. Sometimes they think we did certain things a lot of times, and I'm like, "I think we did that 2 or 3 times." But they were, like, core for
It
them, right?
looms, yes.
Yeah, they loom like that. And so, yeah, those are the kind of things that make for, well, no, to use the language, those are the things with which you can compose a life, a
Yes.
beautiful life, or forge a life, those kind of rhythms and practice, and I think that's what you're getting at with, that's Alexander's idea, right? Tell me his name again?
Christopher Alexander.
Right, right.
Yeah, he's talking about living patterns, habits, or routines or even literal patterns in architecture, because he was an
Okay.
architect,
Okay.
that have that bring aliveness.
Hmm.
And he said, some patterns are dead.
Yeah,
Some
that's
patterns
interesting.
are alive. And I mean, that'd be an interesting thing for us to talk about too. How do you discover which are which, and to what extent is that objective, and to what extent
Mm.
is it subjective? I mean, a lot of the things that we're talking about are shared goods,
Yeah,
um, nature, the body, feasting, which also comes with fasting.
it does. That's right. That's
I
right.
I'm grateful for a pattern that was in my life that is sort of strange, but I just had a sandwich and a piece of fruit every day for lunch. It never was different from that. And
Wait,
that
that was your that you had that every day, like a sandwich?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it was my mom's decision, and
Okay.
that ascetical
Yeah.
pattern is actually part of what prepares you for the feast. So
Uh-huh.
patterns aren't
Uh,
just, the good, special things that you introduce into a life. They're
yeah.
also, I remember our family started going to Vespers once a
Okay.
week
Alright, what's
on
Vespers? Mm.
Saturdays. It's an evening prayer service that lasts for 40 minutes. It's the kind of uh, gladsome light, or fos hilarion, that evening, like the sun is setting. Let's mark this setting of the sun with thanksgiving to God.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and the church is usually dark. There are candles lighted, so it's a very contemplative um, shutting down of the day. And I remember all the things that had to kind of congeal, or compose is a better word,
Mhm.
compose around that one choice, that one decision.
Oh, right. Yep.
You have to stop your Saturday work
Yeah.
uh, in order to get there at 6 o'clock. And then you don't come home really at 7 or something, 30, to start your work again,
Yeah.
and work like a dog into the
Yeah,
night.
yeah.
You kind of stop, and then you have a
Mhm.
meal, and so
Mhm.
there's this, um, pattern of preparation, and that's, really historically, this preparation and fulfillment,
Mhm.
is part of what we understand, that these things come in pairs. Uh,
Mm.
and then, when you're thinking about the work that you have in a week, and it's stopping at 5:30 or something on a Saturday, that means certain things about other days.
Yeah.
And so I found that
Mm.
one commitment helped me to begin to understand time. And time, yes, by the clock, but also it was something about time by significant event. What are the things that you wanna put in your life?
And
Another Oh, yeah, go ahead.
well, I mean, there's a study of time, not to get into this, but there's a study of time, it's called chronemics,
Hmm,
and it's just the study of how different cultures and different nations and relate to time, and how in different moments in our own life we relate to time. Sometimes we talk about chronos time, right?
mhm,
That's just like the ticking of the clock, the
mhm,
second hand on your watch going around, and kairos time, two words for time, and kairos is that sense of like the fulfillment of time, that moments when time seems to slow down. And sometimes those are those moments of the notes that you've put in place, the focal practices of your life, like dinner parties at your house. Time slows down.
mm,
Going for a walk in the woods, time
mhm,
seems to slow down, and you forget that anything else is going on, right? When you ask yourself, "Is there anywhere else I would rather be?" No. Is there anyone else I'd rather be with? No. Is there anything else I'd rather be doing? No. If you can ask those kind of questions and say
mhm.
no to them, you have, a focal practice, or you have one of these kind of, these kind of focal notes around which you can compose your life, I think.
That's a really helpful comment. I'm interested in hearing from you, and I'll give you just one example from myself of people that help to teach you this.
Mm.
Obviously, your parents and your own
Mhm.
family practices, and your wife. But I went to a names day celebration.
Mm.
Um, I had never heard of this. I didn't know what it was, but it
Okay.
was, this person had received a name upon being baptized that was a
Okay.
church name related to a saint. And that was what he was American, but in his culture, he was originally Greek. And in his culture, that's what you celebrated. So
Okay.
I was, maybe 30 and had 3 kids. And he was a Greek immigrant who worked as a painter and had a busy, normal grind kind of life. But this was a Sunday afternoon and everything stopped in his life and they roasted a lamb and they
Mm.
invited everybody. And, I was kind of thinking, well, maybe I'll stop by for an hour. Maybe our family will stop by for an hour. No, you don't go to a lamb roast for an hour.
Of a
And,
Greek family? No, you don't.
and it just struck me, I
Yeah.
don't ever do this. I don't ever stop everything for a feast that is, that cost me so much and feels so valuable.
Mm, mm.
And it really gave me a crisis. I had a kind of crisis of like, why is my life so governed by that 24/7
Yeah.
way of thinking? So that even I didn't have a concept of feast day.
Yeah.
And this person's example, because a lot of times you think, well, the kind of people who do that, they're just different from me. They have
Yeah.
more resources or they
Yeah.
have more sophistication or something. And
Yeah.
that was not the case here. And it was so instructive. It really made me, it was a great teacher for me. He doesn't even know that.
Mm.
Then the next thing that happened was he died a week later.
Oh, wow.
He had a heart
Oh,
attack.
wow.
He was a young man, and that
Mm.
gripped me as well because
Yeah.
I thought, "What if he hadn't stopped for that feast day?"
Yeah.
His life would have been that
Yeah.
24/7
And
convenience
my
store
guess,
hell.
Christine, it could have been that even if he knew he was gonna die in a week, he would have still held that feast.
Even more so he
Yeah,
would have.
right, because that's the kind of thing that makes for a life worth living, is
Yes,
feasting. Why you see and I mean, just think of literature, all the significance of feasts and festivals, I mean, throughout history and throughout literature, it's when you stop working. I mean, all the feasts that are in Lord of the Rings, by Tolkien, right? All the feasts that
yeah,
are in Homer's Odyssey,
yes,
all the feasts that just like mark the time when you stop laboring, you're with other people, you're sharing a meal that costs you something. So there is that kind of discipline and cost that allows you to have this moment. But that moment it feels like a, I don't want to say a distinctly human moment, but it is a moment. It seems like of this kind of either where time slows or time stops or something like that, and to have to build those into your life and to build the other rhythms of your life around those kinds of opportunities or activities or practices seems like how you compose or forge a well-lived ordinary life.
yes, again, when you create that melody
Mm.
line,
Mhm.
then other things gather around it.
Mhm.
And I would go back to that language too of preparation and fulfillment.
Yeah.
Um, it's costly, but it's also an organizing principle.
Yeah.
And what is worth organizing around, is a
Well,
question that I think we're
mm.
all asking ourselves.
That is true, and, I mean, again, to come back to me as a runner, I wanna why do I do that? I wanna be able to run 20 miles through the woods if I want to, or 10 miles through the woods if I want to, and feel good, but there's a cost to be able to do that, right? There's a cost with respect to kinda training, and eating, and discipline, and sleep, and it's almost like when I go out for those kind of runs, that's like the feast. Right,
Mm.
that's the rhythm.
Mhm.
It's like that's when I'm really just out running and enjoying moving, but it requires preparation, it
Mhm.
requires cost, and it means that I'm not able to do some other things because that's the good that I want, one of the goods that I wanna pursue.
Mhm.
I don't think that's too far off
Not in the
what
least,
you're
not in the least,
describing.
and, people also use the language of trade-offs, which I think is less helpful. I mean,
Mm,
it's less distinctive language.
yeah,
I think that feast and fast preparation and
yeah,
fulfillment, um, even, focal points or organizing principles or
mhm,
life-giving patterns, or another language that Christopher Alexander uses, the quality that cannot be named. Uh,
okay.
and
The quality that cannot be named. Okay.
yes, and that
That
patterns
mean?
can amount to. And
Okay.
he's speaking literally about architecture and
Okay.
about, the way in which you can build a room that resolves certain human goods and needs,
Mhm.
that is not subjective.
Yeah, it's that's interesting. The quality that cannot be named. Thinking about architecture as well, when I think about one of the classical defining properties of beauty that we get from the classical medieval tradition is harmony of the parts. Right? Now we're
Mhm.
back to that musical metaphor again. And what makes something beautiful in part is the various parts of it being harmonized somehow. And that's what you're doing when you're designing a building. It's making a harmony of all of these parts. And I,
Mhm.
and I think there's something there for our lives as well. Though some of the parts are a little uglier than others and don't harmonize very well. And so it's also, but that's a little bit some of those dead patterns. To come back to another thing, another idea that you mentioned, like what are those things that, yeah, you know what? These aren't bringing a harmony to my life. This pattern of my life, whether that's a certain bad habit or a certain addiction or a certain practice, these aren't life giving to the kind of ordinary, well lived life that I want to live with my family or in my own life, and having the courage to recognize those and then to say, you know what, I need to let that. I need to let that go.
Yeah, and I think Alexander would use language like wholeness,
Okay.
aliveness,
Yeah.
spirit, human well-being are flourishing in these well-made places. And I think one question we can ask ourselves is, what is the yield? What is the fruit of that pattern that
Hmm.
of that focal pattern?
Yeah.
And typically, we all want to keep doing the things that yield good
Yeah.
fruit and
Life, right?
wholeness
The
and
harmony, the melody, the beautiful music
yes,
that compose, that forge, something useful and beautiful.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think that's, what we're exploring in these 2 podcasts, I
that is
think,
what we're
right? And
exploring.
how
That is.
how has, if you will, how has the, tradition, the literary tradition, philosophical, theological tradition, how have the patterns and exemplars that we've received before us, how do they help us compose a well-lived ordinary life and forge a well-lived ordinary life? And I think that's what we're exploring. And
Which reminds me that you haven't said who your exemplar is. You're this person I gave you the example of this friend.
yeah, I hadn't come up with somebody, so I was going to keep talking and hope you just forgot that I hadn't mentioned mine yet. So I think of several people. I mean, honestly, it is a little hard. The first people that come to my mind are my grandmother and my mother.
Mm.
My grandmother on the farm. She was a farm wife. She was trained as a teacher at Emporia State Teachers College and had a lifetime teaching certificate, and taught a few years, but then became um, a farm wife and mother. And I just saw her rhythms. And one of the rhythms that we always had, that even like my Kim, my wife, will comment on, or people who have come into the family, is that after dinner, nobody leaves the dining room table. We sit around
Mm.
and tell stories. And what everybody would say about both my mom and my grandmother is that they laugh well.
Oh, that's a
And
lovely thing
to
to have
just
said.
there's always more to do on a farm, right? There's always more stuff to do, and the dishes were there to be done, but we always took time to sit around the dining room table and tell stories and laugh. So much
Mm.
so that my wife Kim knows stories about dogs that died before she ever entered the family. Why? Because we told stories about these dogs, because these dogs were part of our history. Wendell Berry would say
Right.
they were part of our membership, right? They were part of our
Yes.
membership. They were part of this story of our own lives. And so sitting around telling stories, and what's my favorite thing to do now with my mom? Is sit around with a cup of coffee, or while mom's making dinner and sitting, I still, as a 54-year-old, I'll sit on the kitchen counter and talk to mom like I did when I was
Mm.
5. And we tell stories
Love
and
it.
we laugh, and that's what we do. And so I think that is my mom and grandmother are exemplars for me about people
Mm.
who had baked into the rhythms of their lives these kinds of practices.
Mm.
But my mom, it wasn't like she had nothing else to do. She was a nurse. She was a university nurse, and she ran the Sunday school program at church, and she was always involved in all kinds of things. But she knew how to build into her life time for stories and laughter and walks in the
Mm.
woods, and I think that set a kind of pattern for me that have been part of the way we've been forging our family's life as well.
And I would say your students' lives, because I've been present with you when you've had your students come to your house to do the same thing, whether they're
Right.
undergrads or graduate students, and seeing you with your schedule, which is like no other schedule, show up for
Yeah.
people when they're doing their senior recital and, you know, staying afterwards and talking to their family and friends. And it strikes me another way that this question could be
Yeah.
asked is what hospitality has been offered to you to enable you to live this way towards others? And you've answered that question, but
Yeah.
that's another way of thinking
Yeah.
in terms of hospitalities.
Mm. Yeah, the ways we've received. I mean, your question about who were your exemplars, in a way, the exemplars, and I can think of professors professors come to mind, having spent a lot of time in school. A lot of my models are
Yeah.
professors. But what they've given me those kinds of gifts, given you those kinds of gifts, and in a way,
Mhm.
that's hospitality, right? Part of the ancient practice of hospitality called xenia, certainly you see in the Odyssey, is one of the things you do. And I love this when somebody would come to your door in the ancient world, certainly in Homer, you would welcome them in because they had a need, and you wouldn't ask them who they were until after you had relieved them of their burden, after you had got their feet washed, after you had set them down for dinner, after you had given them the best food,
Oiled their
after
skin and
what's that?
beard. Oiled their skin and beard.
Oiled their skin, sometimes bathed them, and then after all of that hospitality, you would say, "Oh yeah, and who are you?" Right?
Now
Because
tell
it
us
wasn't
about you.
it's right. And it wasn't predicated on who they were. They didn't matter if they were important. But then when they would leave, often you would give them a host gift to take with them. And
Mhm.
so you were giving them a gift. So it strikes me that those people who kind of were models for us, or maybe some of the
Yes.
people that we'll have on our podcast and talk about how they have composed or forged their life, one of the things they're doing by sharing their stories with us, in a way, is showing hospitality to us, right?
Mhm.
Welcoming us into their lives and then giving us the gift of some of the ways and patterns and practices that have helped them compose and forge their own lives. And so I think that's one of the things that maybe you and I will want to explore with the people that we have on our little podcasts here.
Absolutely. There's absolutely um, nothing sui generis, you people offer something to you
Yeah.
and you, flourish because of it or thrill because of it, and you turn around and desire to offer it to someone else.
Yeah, and
So
that's another focal practice of generosity, hospitality
mm,
and generosity, right? Sharing our lives with others. Well, Christine, I'd love to keep
yeah.
having a conversation with you, but watching the clock tick down here, we're back into Chronos time, watching the second away. Wonder if we should wrap it up. And this has been really wonderful, and I look forward to listening to your podcast,
Likewise.
and how you converse with people about how to compose a life through living rhythms and melodies and patterns and habits. So,
And likewise, I'm looking forward to hearing about the forging that goes
mm,
on in the lives of the people that you talk to, and
I am
the
too.
heat and the shape and the useful beauty that
That's
comes.
right. Yeah, I am too. That's great. Well, with this, I will sign off. Again, this is Brian Williams, Dean of the Templeton Honors College and the host of the podcast Forged.
And Christine Perrin, professor in the Honors College at Messiah University and host of the podcast Composed. Thank you. It's great to
Great.
talk.
Thanks, Christine, as always.